Kanye West, right? Are we even having a conversation about mental health if he doesn't get brought up?
Right.
He said quite a few years ago that he had a sex addiction. And so this brings up another thought regarding that. Is it possible that for, let's just say, someone with bipolar disorder, not sure if that's his deal, but let's just say someone who has bipolar disorder and has huge swings of ups and downs and unsafe behavior, sexual exploits maybe is a part of that sexual behavior. Wouldn't it be inaccurate to diagnose them as a sex addict because that is an acute symptom of a bigger problem?
Right. So hypersexual behavior is a very common feature of bipolar disorder. It's not even rare. Like that is one of the things that as a therapist we look for. You know, have you had those swings where you were excessively sexual? That is a rule out for diagnosing compulsive sexual behavior disorder or for any of the other previous ideas around the diagnosis, because at that point it is a symptom. It's the same way of saying we wouldn't say that the person that went on a shopping spree and went $30,000 in debt while they were manic was dealing with compulsive shopping behavior all the time. We would say, well, they were manic and they made a decision when they were manic. So if the excessive sexual behavior is only occurring in the presence of a manic episode, of that upswing of bipolar, it is not considered CSBD. It's considered, compulsive sexual behavior secondary to a bipolar episode.
Okay, interesting. And what about OCD? Because people who hyperfocus or obsess, as the name implies, they would obsess in behaviors like we all think of hand washing for some reason. For some reason, that's like the first example we all think of. But certainly we wouldn't call that like a hand washing addict. It would be a symptom of OCD. Is OCD kind of in that realm with sex addicts, or is that a completely separate thing because sex addiction is so specialized and large, it deserves its own diagnosis?
So that would depend on which scientist you were talking about.
Oh.
Some scientists do subscribe to the notion that sex addiction is in the same constellation as obsessive compulsive disorders are, and that it's a type of obsessive mental fixation and the compulsion is the sexual behavior. And then I'm kind of on the outside of saying, well, these are all interesting models. I don't know which one's right. I'm more interested in why people think they have a sex addiction than I am on how we accurately classify the exact, features of the disorder, so to speak.
And why is it more common with sex addiction for people to prefer to self-report themselves as a sex addict than, say, something else, like just a cheater?
Right. Well, so there's a lot of reasons that I think that could come up. I mean, one of the really fascinating things about compulsive sexual behavior disorder, about sex addiction, if you will, is that it may be the only addiction where people show up to therapy saying they think they have this, and then it's the therapist's job to decide whether or not they actually do. And what I mean by that is, I can't recall ever working with a client that says, well, I think I have an opioid addiction, and then they come in and it turns out they don't use opioids. Or come in and say, well, I think I might be an alcoholic. And then you ask them, when do they drink? And they're like, well, I drink, once a month and I have 2 drinks at that point in time. Right? That's not a scenario we see. But with sex addiction, we have people coming in and saying it with some regularity. And sometimes it's in response to being caught in an affair. Sometimes it's in response to a spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend, in some cases, catching them viewing porn regularly. In some cases, it's not in response to anything. But when you get into the nitty gritty of the sexual behavior, it's infrequent. It's relatively normal, and it doesn't seem to be interfering with their life other than the mental energy and emotional energy they're spending on it. And what we find is that sex in particular is wrapped up in people's sense of morality. And as it turns out, when you're doing something that violates what your moral foundations are, what your moral kind of code is, that creates feelings of, the term we use is incongruence. There's this misalignment of like what you believe is right and what you should be doing and what you're actually doing. And that disconnect, that dissonance leads people to feel guilt and shame and kind of just torn up inside, for lack of better words. And they often interpret it as an addiction. And so it's often easier to say, well, I must have an addiction because I keep doing this thing that I believe is morally wrong. than it is to say maybe my beliefs about this are unrealistically strict.
I notice a group of people who are being marginalized, and sex seemed to be the biggest area that they were marginalized in. I have friends with disabilities. I dated a man with a disability who, by the way, was very excellent, with his hands, with his mouth, everything. And that kind of got me going. I thought, wow, this guy has reinvented himself. And he was just a fantastic partner to have an experience with. And so I kind of look at it like that. Like sex was missing in my life for a long time. So I can't imagine what it would be like for people with disabilities, that community, whether you're trying to date or get married and have children.
And what surprised you the most after you started your business? There's always, for every business owner, I feel like there's the story, like the one you just shared, and then there's the in the trenches of actually starting it.
Right. What was the most surprising probably was that how popular it was, how needed it was, and how in my first week of business, I received a phone call from a major rehab hospital here in Vancouver to come and meet with them to find out what kind of resources I had and what my plan was. And they were so positive and so helpful.
You know, popularity, unfortunately, kind of lends to credibility to
Yeah.
fringe things. But are they really fringe? And it's not fringe to be a sexual being, but for some reason, we put people with disabilities on the outside of that scope. What's the reason for that? Why do you think that it's so uncomfortable for so many people to think of someone, for example, again, with a spinal cord injury to be having sex?
Well, I think it's fear and I think it's ignorance. So, for people who don't understand the disabled community, they're not going to even have this on their radar that people with disabilities have brains and have nerves and have feelings and have dreams and hormones and desires and wants just like anybody else. I also think that the able bodied community, the way that people with disabilities have been raised and how they've been treated as we grow older into adulthood, the uh, the whole area of treating people with disabilities almost like children, where they are looked after to the point that I believe the term is infanticide, where we think of them as infants and that they're in total need, which may be true for some, that their needs are great. However, they still are human beings, and therefore, from that point alone, they have desires, wants, hormones, all of the stuff that anybody else does.
I'm trying to think of, put myself in the mental state of somebody who might have an argument against this. And I'm sure you can share with me any, pushback that you've received from your community. But the only thing that I can think of is someone might say, doesn't someone with XY disability have more important things to worry about? How would you respond to that?
Well, according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, after shelter, food and water and shelter, it's basically love and sex. So uh, I don't know how anybody would want to say that somebody would have something else on their mind besides that. I guess what that tells me is that there's still that ableist view that someone with a disability really shouldn't even be thinking about it because it's just going to be inconvenient for everyone. So that's how I kind of see it.
Oh, that's interesting that it goes into inconvenience.
Yes.
That is not something I considered. This has been really interesting. I hope that this helps expand people's feelings about or it helps them be more honest about their feelings. I think that's where true transformation takes place. It's not just saying the right thing or being politically correct, but really having a change of heart. And I love that you were open and you shared that you had a relationship with a man with a disability, and that really changed your mind about things. And, we're a bit of a late bloomer, and all of that fits and puts the puzzle pieces together to paint the picture of your motives and who you are. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope that our listeners can, come to an honest place about how they think about others with disabilities having sex, and that there really is more, inclusivity in that department. Any final thoughts before we close?
People with disabilities get horny too.
And then I would just say there are so many hangups in so many religious contexts about sex. It's become such a massive deal, and then it's been reinforced, as a kind of key part of the culture wars and so on. So there's just incredible pressure, and I think that pressure leads to real problems in the way we relate, problems in the way we even approach sexuality and experience sexuality. So I've really interacted with so many couples that have that kind of story, that their sex life is really marred by the guilt that they felt for so long around sex, holding off all those desires, and then getting married, and suddenly they're supposed to just turn themselves on sexually and be completely open and comfortable, and that's really a difficult thing to do, because your mind has been programmed. This is such a bad thing. It's so terrible. The joke is sex is such a terrible, dirty, nasty thing. You should save it for the one you love.
I haven't heard that. That's good. Yeah. That's really good. Oh my gosh. And when you said it puts so much pressure on them, let's be real, by them, we mean her, because I don't know what your experience was, but my experience in my community was, it was definitely the woman's job to dress modestly, swim in a t-shirt and shorts,
Yes,
and
right.
really protect the man's purity, because boys will be boys. And then when you got married, it was like you were expected to also carry the burden of sexual satisfaction and be some sort of, super sexual, awesome, knowledgeable person. But we weren't even allowed to masturbate. Like, there was no discussion of education, no discussion of pleasure. And you're absolutely right about getting married too soon. I even knew someone, and they're still married amazingly, but they married in high school. They were children. Oh, wow. Because their parents didn't want them to have sex before they got married. But for most of us from my community, we are not married to the person that we first got married to. Like, that first marriage, either they're married and maybe it's not the right fit and they're struggling and they're unhappy, or they parted ways.
There are parts of dating that are quite broken today. I think there's a lot of frustration about it. And I think my book was one expression of trying to find a saner, healthier way to approach that. Now, the problem with my approach, it was very control-based. It was very, guilt-based and shame-based and so on. But I really think it's important, from my own standpoint, I want people to have the freedom to do whatever they want. If there are people who say, I want a very restrictive, my family is involved in who I marry, kind of experience of courtship, more power to you. What's important to me is that people are making that decision themselves. It's not being forced on them from anyone else. The same goes with online dating. It's like, if you're enjoying that, you're having lots of different sexual experiences and you're having a great time, wonderful, but I hope that's not because there's this pressure from all your friends that you have to be doing this. I just want to encourage people to be free, to know what they want themselves, to be making decisions that are informed by what's best for them and what they kind of feel good about in the way that they're relating to other people. So I think that, I Kissed Dating Goodbye was trying to ask some questions. I think the answers that it came up with were wrong, but I think every generation is going to keep having to ask those questions. And as we lose like a community-based support system, as we lose the ability to get to know others in contexts that are supported by family and extended community and so on, I think a lot of people feel quite alone and quite frustrated and maybe even scared a little bit by the whole process. And so I worry at times that, the ideas in I Kissed Dating Goodbye will be recycled by someone new. I'm almost positive that's going to happen. But it's
Yeah.
because there's a lot of frustration when it comes to finding a partner, especially in a culture that's quite liberated sexually and so on.
So much frustration. I had some very interesting conversations as part of my research for our discussion.
Did you really?
I really
Yeah.
did. And, I can tell like some of them were, I was just like asking, I had like 3 questions I pulled the audience with. And some of them just answered the questions. And then others, they were like, actually, I really want to dig into this. Can we have a Zoom call? And I'm like, yeah, I haven't talked to you in 20 years. Let's do that. And it was like
Wow.
therapy for us. I love that you say deciding what you want. And for me, that's so key because that's the difference. Because for us, for the ladies of my community, it wasn't about like, let me just be a little TMI for a minute. There were women in my community who didn't use tampons because they felt like that it would diminish their virginal qualities.
Yeah.
And so, and
I've
that
heard of
wasn't
people like that.
because they had biological, anatomical information about, virginal qualities, clearly. It was about, it was like a spell. Like if I'm really pure, if I don't hold hands, if I don't kiss, if I don't think about sex, if I don't masturbate, then I have created the perfect formula that will equal happiness. There was definitely no discussion about like, I will have a good sex life. That wasn't even surprisingly, I think that maybe got taught on the dude side, but on the girl side, it was about, I will be happy, I will be safe, I will be, like all the things that you would want from a marriage will happen.
Right.
And so it obviously created a lot of disappointment because
Yeah,
that has nothing
of
to
course.
do with anything. So I
Yeah.
love the idea of sitting with yourself and deciding what you want, whether it is in this more traditional Tinder online app dating format, or if it has some elements of traditional courtship. So I think that's really powerful.
Well, it's so tied to the family context, right? Like as you're talking about it, the experience of a late 20s single or, a mid 40s single after a divorce or whatever is completely different than the teenager who is making decisions for the first time, whose parents, care about them, want to protect them from real life consequences that can come from the decisions that are made when it comes to sexuality at this age, at that age, that kind of thing. So even as I look back, like I Kissed Dating Goodbye was targeting teenagers. I had just gone through the teen years myself. I was writing to try to inspire teens. And the reasons those very restrictive ideas were so embraced is because there was a whole generation of parents in particular and youth pastors that were wanting to protect their kids from premarital sex because that would lead to, unwanted pregnancies and possibly abortion and AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases. That was the focus of that era. And so the answer was control.
Some people out there may not have ever used a vibrator. The sensation is essentially a kind of a buzz. Right? Some vibrators would feel nothing like a papyrus box or a gourd full of bees, but the vibration that the bees would generate is a vibration. So it's a variant. There is, in fact, a physiological reason that we might like this kind of, whether it's bees, whether it's I choose vibrators personally. I want to leave the bees to do their good work in the world, but we have nerves that reach from our brain down our spine to our genitals that can feel. The nerves are specialized to feel vibration. And we ask ourselves, why would we have vibes? Or why don't we have nerves feel vibration? I don't actually know the answer to that. Did it have to do with herds of early buffalo running across the savannah and people feeling the vibration in their body? I don't know. But it's great that they're there because that's the real reason that people have turned to vibrators as a fun and pleasure-filled experience for genital sensation, and not just an awesome invention for your tennis elbow. By 1917, vibrators, electric vibrators for individual consumption, are the commonest electrified appliance in American households, more so than the electric toaster.
Interesting. Okay, so what does it say about the attitudes towards sex and really the quality of sex that people were having prior, I don't know, just back then, that they didn't know what a female orgasm looked like, and that, I mean, was sex that bad for these ladies that, do you see where I'm going with this? I don't even know how to word this question.
I do. Let me just cut to the chase and say, often it probably was. That's super sad. But remember, it's that bad for some people now. Aww. Because I'm going to put my sexologist hat right back on here. Not just a hoarder of old vibrators. I went to school to think about these things, and what I want to share is, if you don't get good sex education, if you don't have access to it, if you have access to pop culture level sexuality, you may not, in fact, get enough information about pleasure functioning, and you may not know who to trust, right, out in the wilds of the interwebs. So that's a challenge. It's a wheat from the chaff challenge now. It used to be there just isn't enough information, and you had to bust into a university library to get most of it, right? Now it's sort of totally the opposite, and yet people don't necessarily come out of it with enough understanding to function the way that they wish they could, that they believe they ought to be able to.
I'm sure they're connected, but how connected are the stigmas around vibrator use and masturbation? Do you think they're completely connected? Are they related? Are they cousins?
Certainly think they're at least cousins. No, I think they're siblings. I think there is stigma around masturbation regardless of how it's done. And that stigma lives really adjacent to this normative idea that if you're going to have sex, it should be with a person. Someone you love, someone you're committed to, someone you're married to, depending on who you ask, right? That's a moving target, but the underlying normativity is this is to share with someone. And if you don't, you can't get someone to do that with you. And, that's ridiculous because many people can, in fact, find people to do something with them, and they still don't necessarily have an orgasm. And vibrators are designed to stimulate without all of the other things going on that happen during partner sex, much of which is wonderful distraction. Wouldn't trade it for the world, but it's not the same activity as masturbation. It too is related, but it's not the same thing. So even that is knitted into this idea that there's a particular kind of way to be a sexual person.
You wrote in an article that sexuality isn't just about sex. Can you explain what you meant by that a little?
Yeah, so sexuality, and if you look in the ancient texts like the Kamasutra, sex is the physical act. And any two beings, can have sex. But the Kamasutra is really about pleasure. And not everyone, or basically the human mind, can really only understand what pleasure is. And be able to work towards creating pleasure. And sexuality is also about pleasure, it's about seduction, it's about desire. And this is what sex is about. Sex is our highest form of energy, is what Tantra says. Another philosophy that is kind of misconstrued in the West, but Tantra is basically a philosophy that kind of encourages people to embrace everything. Don't deny anything. Don't deny, sex. Don't deny your sin. Don't deny the darker side of yourself. So sexuality is a very encompassing topic that really, really I think if you get to the core of it, what we're all seeking when we're looking for good sex, it's not really good sex, it's pleasure, good intimacy.
When you mentioned the Kama Sutra in the West has a lot to do with Cosmopolitan magazine. So can you explain the difference between the Kama Sutra in the Indian writings versus what most of us picked up in 8th grade?
Yeah, so in the West, they consider Kama Sutra just about these positions. And like I mentioned earlier, the Kama Sutra is not focused on positions. The positions are also a very, very small part of what the Kama Sutra has to offer. Now, like I said, the Kama Sutra was written 300 AD, thousands of years ago. And the Kama Sutra is about pleasure. It was actually written for women, for teaching a man how to pleasure a woman. And there's so many different versions of the Kama Sutra, because each time a king came into his kingdom, the Kama Sutra was commissioned, because they believed that if two couples, or if two people were able to reach their find pleasure in their physical intimacy, if that couple was happy, that meant society would be stable, and if society was stable, that meant the kingdom would be stable. So their whole life was based on people finding their pleasure and their happiness within the relationships, which would obviously ripple out into the kingdom. And so the Kama Sutra is a very, very powerful text, and it has lots of offerings and lots of knowledge on how to, I don't like the word seduce, but I guess seduce is the only word I'm limited to. Seduce a lover. The Kama Sutra is basically focused on refinement and beauty and enchantment and making love and having pleasure. And, in the West, it's very much degraded to like, oh, you need to do like this position to like get this. And like, it's very much like physical goal oriented, which is what it's not at all.
Yeah, it's almost like our Industrial Revolution also had an effect on our attitudes on sex. But what you just said about, when you're happy in your sexuality and you're like when couples are happy with one another and they're experiencing intimacy on all levels, how that really does make society better. Like I just got goosebumps because that's so true. And we don't always value it in that way. And we definitely have almost, like an industrial attitude. Like, if you pull it down the assembly line and then you push these 3 buttons, then you get what you want out of it. I don't know. It's not as like, I mean, I'm not in every American household, but I'm going to go out there and say that this is not a normal, typical approach for Americans to view sexuality, but I love it. I love the interruption of our thoughts about what we have always perceived as typical. Hey, you're still here. Thanks for watching. If you love breaking free from the algorithm to explore curiosity, join me each week by hitting subscribe and the bell for new upload notifications.